Well, welcome. I was thrilled to get the invitation to join you for this webinar. My name is Erik Carter. I'm an associate professor of special education at Vanderbilt University, and my research and teaching focuses on identifying those skills and supports and connections and relationships that young people with disabilities need to live a rich, good life during and after high school. And so in my brief time today, I'm going to really focus on why transition matters in the lives of young people with significant disabilities, and why the efforts that we make as schools and communities and families and businesses really hold such great potential to shift the outcomes that those young people attain, both during and after high school. And in particular, I'm going to focus my time today on what we're learning from a project focused specifically on connecting young people with disabilities to early work and community experiences. Our focus is really on increasing access to summer employment as a way to set students on a course towards meaningful careers after high school. What I thought I would do is start by bringing you back to high school. Transport yourself back to 9th or 10th or 11th or 12th grade and think about the aspirations that you had for life after high school. You probably had some combination of great expectations or maybe even some hesitations or apprehensions, but quite likely you had some vision of what a good life would be like for you after high school. And that's also true for young people with significant disabilities. I get to spend a lot of time talking to young people with disabilities about what they hope for after high school, after graduation. And they talk about things like having a great job, a safe and comfortable place to live, friends in the community, a chance to give back and be involved in community life, a reliable way to get around, all of the things that all of us aspire to as we think about life after high school. But the difference is that for many young people with significant disabilities, those aspirations don't always materialize. The employment and college and community living outcomes for young people with disabilities, while they've improved over time, there's still a long way to go for our field. So what I wanted to do is just start by highlighting some of what we know about the outcomes of young people in those early years after high school. I put on your screen findings from the National Longitudinal Transition Study 2, which looked at the post-school experiences of students with disabilities from 2000 to 2010. It followed a cohort of young people who were ages 13 to 16 for 10 years until they'd gone through high school and up to 8 years after leaving high school. And if you, as you can see on the screen, the employment outcomes for many young people with disabilities between the first National Longitudinal Transition Study and the second National Longitudinal Transition Study have improved. For students with learning disabilities, emotional behavioral disabilities, and visual impairments, the percentage of those students who are working for pay up to 2 years after high school has improved quite substantially. But you'll notice on the far right of your screen that for students with intellectual disabilities, many of them still are not able to access early work experiences in those first 2 years after high school. Only 42% of young people with intellectual disabilities were working at any point up to 2 years after high school. And if you stretch that timeline out up to 4 years after high school, you can see that while many young people are connecting to work experiences, many more are not. For students with autism, only 61% of young people with autism have worked at any time up to 4 years after leaving high school. For students with intellectual disabilities, only 44% of those students have worked up to 4 years after high school. And for students with multiple disabilities, only 46%. So for many young people who aspire to a good job in the years after leaving high school, that dream remains elusive. And yet, this is the charge of special education services. Right on the very front pages of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, it talks about the purpose of special education, which is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and to prepare them for further education, for employment, and independent living. So in some ways, the outcomes that young people are attaining in the years after high school serve as sort of a barometer for the effectiveness and impact of what we do during those middle school and high school years. And so this really, I think, these outcomes really pose a challenge to us to think about what really ought we be doing in terms of transition services and supports for young people with significant disabilities while they're still in high school? What can we do that will really make a real difference in the outcomes that they attain in the years after leaving high school? Well, this has been the focus of one aspect of our project. We spent some time looking at data from the National Longitudinal Transition Study 2, which I mentioned earlier, and if you're interested in learning more about that project, their website is www.nlts2.org. You can learn more about the outcomes for young people in a range of disability categories, not just work outcomes, but also college and relationship and community living outcomes as well. We spent some time looking at outcomes specifically for young people with significant disabilities. And by significant disabilities, I'm referring to students who are served under the categories of intellectual disabilities or autism or multiple disabilities who are also eligible for the alternate assessment or whose parents indicated they had pretty significant functional skill deficits. So we're focusing on a subset of young people with significant disabilities, and you can see on your screen just a description of who those students were. In the National Longitudinal Transition Study 2, there were over 1,500 students who were in Wave 1, which means they were in high school in 2000. And we looked at the outcomes for those students in the 2 years after leaving high school. So our sample focused on about 450 of those students. And we looked at a range of factors that might be associated with employment after high school. Our focus was on to what extent are young people with significant disabilities attaining paid community-based work experiences up to 2 years after high school. What factors might account for some students who are connected to those work experiences and others who aren't? Well, it may be that prior work experience makes a difference, that those students who are working during high school are more likely to work after high school. Or maybe it has to do with the sort of characteristics of students themselves, their gender or race ethnicity or their disability category. Or perhaps it's skill-related factors that make the biggest difference, whether students have strong communication skills, are able to dress and feed themselves independently, have strong social skills or self-advocacy skills. Perhaps those are factors that really make a difference between those students who are working and those who aren't. We also were interested in whether family factors make a difference. What about parent expectations? Did those shape students' post-school outcomes? What about the availability of transportation or parent levels of education or employment? Do those shape expectations and drive student outcomes? And last, we looked at the category of school-related factors. Perhaps it's those classes that we offer to students, the job skills training, the job search instruction, the job coaching that we offer. Perhaps it's what schools do that really shape those outcomes more than anything. So our interest was in looking at what are the outcomes of young people with significant disabilities and what can we learn about what sets them on a course for future employment after high school. Here's a glimpse of what we found. For students with significant disabilities, we were disappointed to learn that only 1/4, 26% of students with disabilities were working in those first 2 years after high school. And so 26% were working. That shows it can be done, but 74% weren't. And so of those students who were working, nearly half of those jobs were jobs in which only other people with disabilities worked as well. So they were segregated jobs. Pay was relatively low, and young people worked about 21 hours per week. So what makes the difference between those 26% of young people who were working after high school and those 74% who weren't working? So we looked at those factors that I mentioned just a bit earlier, and we found that one of the most prominent predictors of whether students were working after high school was whether or not they had paid work experiences during high school. So those students who had paid work experiences were 2.5 times more likely to be working after high school than those who didn't. And that really lays out a nice pathway for those of us who work in high schools and middle schools. It really pushes us to think about the power of those early work experiences and challenges us to think about what are the venues through which we can connect young people with disabilities to those kinds of work experiences. So paid work experiences really do make a difference. Second thing we looked at was student demographic factors. And of the various factors that we looked at in our analysis, we found that males were twice as likely to be working as females in the years after high school, the early years after high school. And so that should really challenge us to think about making sure that early work opportunities and career development activities are equally available or equitably available to all students while they're still in middle school and high school. We also looked at a number of skill-related factors. What are the skills that we might teach students and emphasize in our programs that could set them on a course for future adulthood. And as is often discussed in the literature, social skills seem to really matter. Students who had high ratings of social skills were 2.5 times more likely to be working after high school relative to those individuals who had low ratings of social skills. And independent skills also seem to make a difference. Those students who were able to feed or dress themselves more independently, they were 2.7 times more likely to be working after high school. So we know that early work experiences make a difference. We also know that there are some skills that we might target that we really can shape in those through our curricular interventions and social skills interventions. Another factor that seems to really make a difference, which surprised us in terms of its prominence, was the role of family expectations. So when parents in high school expected their adolescent child to work in the years after high school, those students were nearly 3.5 times more likely to get a paid job after high school. And similarly, parents who had high household responsibilities for their child while they were in high school, chores around the house, for example, those students were nearly 2 times as likely to be working after high school. So parent expectations can make a profound difference in the future employment outcomes of young people with disabilities. The last thing that we looked at was that list of school-related factors that I mentioned earlier. We were really surprised that none of those factors, not the goals that students held, the classes that they took, none of those were predictors of post-school employment outcomes when considered alongside early work experiences. So early work experiences, hands-on work experiences in the community, were a more powerful predictor of post-school employment outcomes than the kinds of more indirect experiences we offer in high school. And that's not to suggest that what we offer in schools in terms of coursework and skills instruction isn't important, but we need to couple that with real-life, hands-on work experiences in the community for students with significant disabilities. That seems to be the pathway to post-school employment outcomes. So we know that many young people with significant disabilities aren't working after high school, but we also know something about the kinds of things that we can do during middle school and high school that can increase the number of students who are able to access those work experiences. So that really means that middle school and high school is a critical juncture. And the kinds of programs that we offer, the supports we offer, and the opportunities we offer hold great potential to make a real difference in the outcomes of young people. And that's really where I want to turn next. What could we do during those high school years, for example, that would prepare students well for future jobs and raise their aspirations for future jobs? Well, as part of our project, one of the things that we looked at was the extent to which high schools were offering an array of career development activities. This will be a little bit hard to read on your screen. We'll post this as a handout. But one of the studies we did looked at the extent to which high schools were offering things like career interest assessments, tours of colleges or technical schools, job shadowing programs, having speakers brought in from local businesses. We looked at whether they offered career exploration courses or college fairs or career days, tours of businesses, career and job counseling, career aptitude assignments, apprenticeship programs, paid or unpaid internships, job fairs or career days, tech prep programs, career or job resource centers, whether they helped students with written career plans, offered cooperative education programs, held job placement services for students, offered mentorships for students, or offered school-based enterprises or businesses. So there's an array of things that schools might offer by way of career development preparation for all students in a school. We were interested in the extent to which students with significant disabilities were accessing those experiences. And we were disappointed to learn that despite the fact that many high schools offer a wealth of career development activities, the challenge becomes helping young people with significant disabilities access those existing opportunities. We found, and you'll see this highlighted on the screen, that in many of these schools that we worked with, none or few students with significant disabilities were accessing those kinds of career development activities. So in one part, that's a missed opportunity for students with significant disabilities, and is a challenge for us who are teachers, special educators, general educators, and vocational educators to think about how we might better connect young people with disabilities to those kinds of already existing learning opportunities. The other venue that holds promise for shaping the post-school employment outcomes of young people with disabilities is early work experiences. As I mentioned before, people who work during high school are 2.5 times more likely to be working after high school. And yet, when we looked at data from the National Longitudinal Transition Study at the extent to which students in all of the different disability categories had worked at any point during the prior year while still in high school, we found that while students with learning disabilities and other health impairments worked at fairly high rates, only 15% of students with autism had held a job in the past year. Only 22% of students with multiple disabilities had worked at any point in the last year, and only 36% of students with intellectual disabilities had worked at any point in the last year. So that really set the context for Project Summer. Project Summer was the name of our project. This was a IES-funded project. It was funded by the National Center for Special Education Research at the Institute of Education Sciences. And our charge was to develop a set of strategies that schools and communities could use to connect young people with significant disabilities to work experiences in their communities. And our particular focus, as the name of our project suggests, was on summer employment. We really saw this as an untapped opportunity for many young people with disabilities. Those of you who are watching, many of you probably worked at some point during high school, and probably 2/3 to 4/5 of you worked at some point in the summer. This is what young people do in the summer months. Many work, so it's a normative experience for many high school students. It's also a time when there are typically more job openings for young people. And so it increases the opportunities, the availability of jobs for students with significant disabilities as well. There's a lot of concern and tension about job experiences during the school year, sort of the sense that should we be focusing on academics, should we be focusing on community-based experiences? Well, summer employment opportunities don't force that tension. So you can work during the summer months and hopefully continue those jobs after school or on weekends during the school year, so there's not competition between academics and work. For students with significant disabilities, summer jobs might actually reduce learning loss that happens over the 2 or 3 months when they're not in school. And if students start working in the summer months early on, it means they can start working much earlier than they typically have their first job. And if you add up all of the summer months for students with significant disabilities from age 14 to age 21, you'll find that there's about 2 years of potential work experiences that students might gain. And for many students, those are missed opportunities right now. So summer is a real opportune time to promote early work experiences, and yet it's not a time we often talk about in school-based planning and transition services. So as I mentioned, our charge was to figure out what might schools do in partnership with communities to begin to tap into this opportune work time. We had 3 phases to our development project, and over the course of the remainder of this webinar, I want to walk through each of these 3 phases to give you a glimpse into what we learned about factors that might make a real difference in connecting students to these kinds of experiences. So in phase 1, our focus was really on learning the extent to which young people with disabilities were working during the summer months. There hasn't been good data on the extent to which that's happening. And because we knew that some students would be connected to those kinds of work experiences, we wanted to know what makes the difference between those students who are working and those students who aren't. Those students who are engaged in kind of meaningful summer activities and those who are really kind of just sitting at home or sitting on the couch. So what differentiates sort of successful summer outcomes from less successful outcomes? That was one part of our project. The second part was to make sure that whatever we developed was going to work in everyday schools and communities. So we spent a lot of time talking to key stakeholders, and I'll highlight some of what we learned from teachers and family members and businesses and employer networks about how to design services and supports that really make sense for a community and are feasible with their resources. Both of those phases of the project helped us design a set of 5 intervention practices that were implemented in a subset of high schools in Wisconsin. And we wanted to know if you combine these strategies and implement them for students, is it going to produce a noticeable change in the extent to which students are accessing those early work experiences? So phase 3 really focused on, well, what's the impact of these services or these practices on youth summer employment outcomes. So we'll walk through each of these phases, and I'll highlight some of what we learned along the way about each. First phase, as I mentioned, was a descriptive study where we just wanted to learn to what extent are young people with disabilities accessing these kinds of summer employment experiences that are pretty typical in most communities for most high school students. So this is a project that was carried out in Wisconsin. It involved nearly 400 students with disabilities, about 136 of whom had significant disabilities, which meant they had disability labels of intellectual disabilities or autism, and they were eligible for the state's alternate assessment. So these are students with the most extensive support needs in their schools. And on your screen you can get a sense of who these students were in terms of their demographics: gender, race, ethnicity, grade, age level, and free and reduced lunch status. These were students who were drawn from 34 high schools across the state. Some were rural, some were urban, and some were large or mid-sized cities. So you can get a sense of the range of schools in which these students were attending. And we were interested in whether summer employment opportunities really different in more urban areas than they did in more rural areas. Because there's a whole host of issues that come up in each of those areas that might really call for different responses in terms of services and supports. We collected a range of measures for all of the 400 students who were part of our project. We collected information about their self-determination, their employment and transition skills, their social skills. We asked questions of teachers and youth and parents about students' future goals, their expectations for these students in terms of summer work experiences. And we looked at the kind of coursework that they took during the prior school year before the summer months. We also then, to learn about the extent to which they were working in the summer, we called all of those 400 youth or their parents at the beginning of summer and then again at the end of summer, so around June and August, to learn about the extent to which they were accessing those summer experiences and the kinds of services and supports that wrapped around them to make that happen. And here's what we learned. Across those 400 students, we learned that about 2/3 of students with learning disabilities worked at some point in the summer months. And interestingly, that's just about typical for what youth without disabilities work. In most summers, a little bit lower over the past few years, between 2/3 and 3/4 of youth without disabilities worked at some point during a given summer. For students with emotional and behavioral disabilities, only about 40% of those students were working at any point in the summer. And when we took a closer look at those two time points, we found many of those young people with emotional behavioral disabilities who were working at the beginning of the summer had lost their jobs or changed jobs by the end of the summer. And that really spoke to the need to find really strong job matches for them and to think maybe differently about how supports are provided for students who often don't identify as having a disability at their job sites. For students with intellectual disabilities who weren't alternate assessment eligible, nearly 1/3 of those students, 35%, were working during the summer months. But if you had a significant disability, only 15% of those students were working at any point during the summer months. So this really suggests there's a missed opportunity for many young people with significant disabilities who would love to work, who would love to earn a little extra money in the summer, and who might want to explore some of their own career interest during those 3 months when school's not in session. So one of the things we were particularly interested in understanding more about is what makes the difference between those 15% of students with significant disabilities who were working and the 85% who weren't. So we looked at a range of measures that we had collected. We looked at students' age, gender, race, ethnicity, whether they were free and reduced lunch eligible. We looked at their ratings of social skills and self-determination, whether they had high or low levels of problem behavior. We looked at teacher expectations for whether students would work in the summer months, and we looked at whether students had worked during the prior school year, so whether they were working during the spring prior to summer. And last, we looked at ratings of those students' job skills. When you looked at all of those factors together, there were two things that shook out as having the highest predictive value of whether students worked during the summer months, and they might surprise you. The two things that jumped out as really making the difference between those students who worked and didn't work were these. Teacher expectations. When teachers during the school year had expectations that these students would find or pursue a job during the summer months, those students were many times more likely to be working during the summer months. And similarly, for students who had been connected to jobs during the spring semester, they were also much more likely to either maintain those jobs during the summer months or find new jobs during the summer months. So this really speaks to two things. One is putting this on the radar of teachers very early on and raising their expectations for thinking about summer as an opportune time to work, but also finding ways to connect students to paid jobs long before the last day of school when the school bus no longer shows up. So spring work experiences and teacher expectations really do make a difference. And when we looked a little bit closer at the sorts of things that teachers were doing during the school year to prepare for summer employment, we found that only 1/4 of all teachers in our project, of the 400 students with whom we focused on in this phase of the project, only 1/4 had had any kind of conversation with their students about the upcoming summer. And so we thought this is also perhaps a missed opportunity to do some planning around those 3 months when school isn't in session. So we learned quite a bit in that early phase about some things that might make a difference in increasing employment outcomes when we parked those as we thought about how to develop a set of intervention strategies that might make a difference in the lives of young people with disabilities. The second phase of the project, which overlapped with the first, involved spending a lot of time talking to key stakeholders about their perspectives of the facilitators and barriers to summer work experiences for students with disabilities. We interviewed teachers. We talked with parents of kids with disabilities. We interviewed youth themselves and held focus groups about what they thought about summer activities and their intentions to work and the expectations parents and teachers had for summer work experiences. We surveyed chambers of commerce throughout the state to ask about the roles that they might play in helping connect young people with disabilities or informing teachers about viable employment opportunities in their local community. We held focus groups with employers to inquire about what they were looking for in youth employees. And we interviewed community connectors who played a role in connecting young people with disabilities to jobs out in the communities. We held a series of community conversations where we looked at what the resources and assets and connections existed within a given community that could be drawn upon to improve youth employment. And we did surveys of school administrators to find out about the career development programming that they offered in their schools and the extent to which young people with disabilities were accessing those early work experience or those career development experiences. So our goal here was really to learn from each of these stakeholders about what it would take to improve summer employment outcomes for young people with disabilities. And I'll highlight just a couple of the findings from these projects. Each of them you can learn more about if you're interested in learning, if you're interested in reading studies associated with each of those stakeholder groups. We'll post a list of references that you can draw upon on the website where this webinar is hosted. But we talk with teachers, for example, about the viability of summer as a place for emphasizing early work experiences, and they saw the value of summer employment. Repeatedly, they saw that those 3 months were often untapped times or times when students were really missing out on opportunities to develop their transition portfolios, build their resumes, and learn skills that would help them in future careers. They also thought of some ways that summer employment could be supported, whether through rethinking how we do extended school year services or reconfiguring staffing during the summer months or thinking about new ways to address transportation issues. But they also acknowledge that it's going to take more than just teachers to connect young people to summer work experiences. They already had lots on their plate, and they needed partnerships with people who knew business well or who knew where the employment opportunities were. They needed partnership with families who would be supporting their students in the summer months or their children in the summer months, and they needed strong partnerships with other community members. So that had to be an important part of, has to be an important part of any school's response, is developing those kinds of partnerships. We also, as I mentioned, surveyed chambers of commerce throughout the state. Almost every community has an employment network like a chamber of commerce, and we were interested in the extent to which they saw themselves as potential partners in increasing youth employment opportunities. The way we did that is that we surveyed these chambers of commerce throughout the state, and we asked them the extent to which they felt partnering in each of 17 or 18 ways would be viable for them given their current resources and staffing. And we were surprised at the extent to which chambers of commerce said they would be willing to help co-sponsor a job fair or co-sponsor a job shadowing day, their willingness to help match youth to job openings in the community, or to provide feedback to teachers at the school about the quality of their career development and vocational programs. Many were willing to speak at high schools or to invite teachers to speak at chamber meetings about the needs of youth with disabilities in their community. So there's a range of ways that you can see on their screen that chambers of commerce were willing to partner if they were asked, and many reported that they were simply never asked by schools to partner in these ways. What was interesting in this particular study is that we asked some chambers to respond to the ways in which they would partner with schools in reference to students with disabilities, and some chambers we never mentioned students with disabilities, and we just asked whether they'd partner in these ways for youth in general. What we learned by dividing up the surveys in that way is that when asked about supporting schools to help students with disabilities connect to jobs, chambers were a little bit more reluctant and less likely to say that was a feasible option. And so that really speaks to the need to approach chambers in ways that perhaps reflect the needs of all students in a school and help them understand the ways in which the things that they already do might be a valuable asset for students with disabilities. So many of the chambers, which are themselves connected to businesses throughout that community, were willing to partner with schools, but really needed to be asked and directed to understand what form that partnership might take. So I've gone through fairly quickly 2 phases of the project that give you a glimpse into what seems to make a difference in terms of promoting early work experiences for students with disabilities, as well as some of the perspectives of teachers, family members, youth, employers, and other stakeholders on what would facilitate or hinder early work experiences for young people with disabilities. During the final phase of our project, we tried to merge all of the lessons from these 2 phases into an intervention package that we piloted with 7 high schools in Wisconsin. Here the charge was to figure out if we identify a set of strategies that schools and communities could use, would those strategies work in terms of would they promote better outcomes for young people with disabilities, and would they be feasible for everyday schools? So our intervention package involved 5 strategies, and I'm going to walk through each of these one at a time, but they involved a series of community conversations that were held in each community. Each community did resource mapping to identify resources and assets that could be drawn upon to promote youth employment and community involvement. Each of those communities did summer-focused planning with students to do some thinking about the opportunities that existed in the community, the kinds of jobs students might want to have, and the supports that would need to be in place to make that happen. Each of those high schools identified community connectors who would serve as a bridge between the planning that occurred with students and the opportunities that existed in local communities. So their job was really to kind of connect students' interests with employment opportunities. And they did that by partnering with employer liaisons, someone on the business side in each community who knew that community well, who knew where the jobs were, and could if they knew what a student's interests were, find a potential employer who could use someone with those gifts and interests. So I'll walk through each of these 5 strategies before I share back with you how the combination of these strategies made a difference in the employment outcomes of students who participated in this project. So let's start with community conversations. Each of the 7 high schools that participated in this project were involved in hosting a community-wide conversation really focused on how that community, that local community, could draw upon all the strengths and resources and assets it had to improve employment opportunities for young people with and without disabilities. The way these conversations often worked is they involved inviting a broad cross-section of the community together for usually a 2-hour evening event. It was done over coffee and desserts, and was a time when civic leaders, school leaders, teachers, parents, youth, employers, community members, local community nonprofits would all gather together and brainstorm what resources they had that could be drawn upon by schools to improve employment outcomes. So the way these community conversations were launched was through a series of invitations that went out either by Evite or electronic invitation or via email or through announcements in newspapers or through invitations that were posted throughout the local community, inviting anyone in that community to a community conversation on increasing employment for youth with disabilities. So you can get a glimpse of the different ways that communities might have invited folks. And we were struck by just how many people in the community showed up for these events. More than 350 community members came out for these 7 events. They ranged in size from as few as 20 members in a community to as many as 80 people coming out for this evening event. And you'll see on your screen just a glimpse of some of the roles of individuals who came to these events. folks from schools, folks from community agencies, from nonprofit organizations, local employers, civic leaders, congregational leaders, all showed up because they were asked to share their ideas and their input on how that community could work more in tandem to improve employment outcomes for all students. The idea with these community conversations is you want to bring in people who are working within the service system, but you also want to get lots of folks who are working beyond the service system, beyond the usual suspects, as we say. And so at these conversations, a large percentage of individuals who came were school staff, or folks from human services, but there was also a large number of employers who came, and family members, and youth themselves, as well as others who it might have included civic leaders, or media, or mayors, or others. So for those 2 hours, there's a kind of a structured approach that is used to elicit ideas for how the community could address employment for youth with disabilities, and it begins by introducing the topic for the evening. So for about 10 minutes, someone might facilitate the discussion by introducing the overall goal for the project, which is to increase employment outcomes. They might highlight some of the contributions of early work experiences to youth development and long-term outcomes. They might highlight some of the changing demographics of the community and the need to ensure that there's a strong local workforce. And they also highlighted a lot of businesses that are already hiring youth with disabilities to show that it really can be done in this particular community. So for about 5 or 10 minutes, the topic for the evening is introduced, and then the facilitator poses the questions that matter. And in this case, the question that was posed at each of these events was, what can we do as a community to open up summer employment opportunities for youth with disabilities? You'll notice it's a very asset-focused question. It's not focused on what are we doing wrong, where are we falling short, but it's really getting people to think creatively about what could we do. For about 15 minutes to 20 minutes, folks around round tables begin to discuss their own ideas for that around that question. You might have parents and teachers and youth and someone from Social Security all sitting down at the same table, sharing their ideas and building off each other's ideas as well. So that goes on for about 15 or 20 minutes. Someone rings a bell and everyone gets up and moves to a different table, and they continue the conversation on that same question, sharing some of the ideas they heard during the previous round of discussion, building on those and expanding and deepening those ideas. So you might have now someone who's a business owner sitting down with someone from a faith community, sitting down with a parent and a mayor and someone from the Chamber of Commerce, each sort of raising some of the issues that they see and identifying solutions to common barriers in that local community. That happens often 2 or 3 times, and at the end of 2 or 3 rounds of discussion, after everyone is kind of mixed up and spoken with as many as 16 or 18 other individuals, there's the harvest time where everyone shares back the very best ideas that they heard throughout the evening in kind of a group share back. So someone will often stand at the front of the room with butcher paper up on the walls, and people will share the very best ideas that they heard. And the idea here is really to pinpoint the next 3 or 4 or 5 steps that the community might take to become a place where youth employment opportunities really abound. So in addition to what people are sharing back at the end of the evening, throughout the evening people have been writing their ideas down on paper tablecloths. At each table there's been a table host who's been writing down every idea that was shared. And so the community really ends up with a roadmap for what they might do next in terms of expanding employment opportunities in their local community. I've put up on your screen just some examples of the ideas that came from different from some of the various communities that were part of this phase of the project. And at the end of the evening, after all the ideas are compiled, a team usually comprised of folks from the high school and likely from local community agencies compile all of the ideas that were shared into a report that goes back to folks who attended as well as people who were unable to attend. So you can see here on your screen an example of a section of one of those community conversation summary reports where they highlighted some of the barriers that businesses raised in terms of issues that businesses raised related to hiring people with disabilities. They might not be aware or know how to hire people with disabilities, or they might have concerns about training costs or high turnover rates. And accompanying that is all of the solutions or responses that were identified in that community that address those core barriers. So essentially the community is left with a roadmap of where they might go next in terms of strategies to increase employment opportunities. So for example, in one of the community conversations, the theme of the role of chambers of commerce in promoting the idea of hiring people with disabilities was really emphasized. And so within a week or two after the community conversation event, the Chamber of Commerce, which I think represented several hundred, if not 1,000 local businesses, put in their Chamber of Commerce newsletter an announcement calling upon businesses that were willing to hire youth with disabilities to contact the local high school to share that interest. And a number of summer jobs came out of that particular announcement. What was interesting is that among these 350 people who came to these conversation events across those 7 communities, most, even though they were already connected to disability issues or employment issues, reported that they learned about resources and opportunities and connections in their community that they simply didn't know about because they had an opportunity to sit down with so many people who represented a cross-section of their community. Many of them, the large majority, said that they agreed or strongly agreed that the conversation would contribute to better employment outcomes for youth in their community. And when asked about whether they were able to identify things that they personally could do to improve employment outcomes as a result of the conversation, the vast majority of attendees said that they learned, that they agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. And finally, when asked whether the conversation improved their own perceptions of their community's capacity to improve work employment outcomes for youth with disabilities, the vast majority felt that was the case. So these are relatively easy, fun, engaging ways to bring in lots of new people to work in tandem to improve youth employment outcomes, as well as to make a lot of connections that teachers reported they need with businesses and transportation providers and agencies to support those kinds of summer employment experiences. Those events were all held in Wisconsin. I now live in Nashville, Tennessee. We recently hosted one of these events that drew 80 members of our community, and you can see on your screen an example of what our invitation looked like, what our core questions were for the evening, and it was a very productive time where we really were able to pinpoint some next steps for that community in terms of where we might go to improve employment outcomes. If you're interested in hosting an event like this, we've got some resources that you can draw upon. I put on your screen a guide that we've developed. It's completely free and can be downloaded at the website that I've included on the screen. It's a step-by-step guide for launching inclusive efforts through community conversations. And this will walk you through how to set up a community conversation, how to invite folks, and how to facilitate such an event. So that was the first strategy. I spent a little bit more time on that than I will on the other strategies because I think that's a little bit new in terms of an approach for schools and communities. The second approach is going to be familiar to many of you. It involved resource mapping. There's a lot of conversation about the importance of mapping the resources and opportunities that exist in a community so that that information is available to all teachers and all parents and all community members and all providers. And so what we did is in each of these 7 communities, we helped those communities map all of the different opportunities and supports that could be drawn upon to connect students to summer jobs or other kinds of recreational opportunities in their community. Some of those ideas for opportunities came from the community conversations themselves, but we set up a website where people could submit their own ideas for resources and opportunities in their local community. And all of that information then was compiled into a guide that was posted online and could be shared back with families, teachers, and others who were interested in knowing what resources could be drawn upon to support a particular child that they worked with. So these guides can all be downloaded from the website that I shared with you earlier. And just to give you a glimpse of what they look like inside, the guides were organized around ways that youth might actually draw upon the information. So the guide was organized around 5 themes of resources for getting around town because transportation is often such a barrier to employment. A section on finding friends and fun activities, a section on searching for a job, a section on keeping a job, and a section on volunteering and community service because we know that volunteering and community service can be also a way that students develop skills that help them in their future careers. So on your screen is just a glimpse of some of those entries. You'll see they included the organization, a website, a contact phone number, and a description of what the resource was. Some of them focused on recreation opportunities, other on youth development opportunities. And where we could, we included the names of people in these organizations who would be really receptive to thinking about how youth with disabilities could participate. So each of the communities developed a resource map that could be drawn upon by teachers and parents and youth themselves. And then the third strategy that each school implemented involved summer-focused planning. And this was not designed or intended to be a separate planning meeting, another IEP meeting, or another transition planning meeting, but simply an approach to ensure that conversations about summer months occurred between students and youth, students and teachers and their family members. So sometimes conversations about summer could happen within the context of IEP meeting, or they were happening through casual conversations that teachers had with students over the course of the school year. So we developed just a 2-page planning tool. It's something that you can download if you're interested in using it as is or adapting. And it focused on just some core questions. The first was asked who was part of that planning meeting. And it was really important that youth themselves be part of those discussions. But we really encourage those discussions not only to happen between teachers and youth, but also family members and perhaps employers or other community members who might have some connection to what the students' goals were for the future or for the upcoming summer months. The second question on the planning tool is, what are some of the students' long-term big pictures goals for life after high school? And it's really important to link summer experiences to future long-term aspirations. So it may be that if a student has a particular goal to work in a particular industry, summer jobs can be a way of sampling what that might be like and building a resume that would lead them towards a job in that particular employment sector. The third question asks about what students' short-term goals are for the upcoming summer months that might lead them or set them on a course towards that future goal. And so on the next page, the second page of the form, it asks the team to list each of those summer-related goals, and for each of those goals, to brainstorm what are some possible places in the community that those goals can be met. Who do we already know or do we need to seek out that might help connect the student to those kinds of goals? What are the supports or resources that are needed to make that happen? And then for each of those resources or supports, who's going to take responsibility for following up on that? Sometimes that would be parents, sometimes that would be teachers, sometimes that would be youth themselves. But it's a very simple format for embedding those kinds of questions in existing planning meetings. And we've put a resource, a citation on the bottom of your screen if you want to read more about how to implement that kind of summer-focused planning. The fourth strategy involved identifying 1 or 2 people that we called community connectors at each high school. Sometimes they were paraprofessionals, sometimes they might be a special educator, sometimes they could be a parent advocate or a guidance counselor, or really anyone who is interested in serving in that role. But the idea is that as planning is done, you need someone who can connect a student's goals and plans for the upcoming summer to real opportunities in the local community. We've all been part of planning processes where we developed really well-crafted plans, and they fall short because there isn't someone to help make sure it's actually followed through and implemented. So in each of these schools, 1 or 2 community connectors were identified who, after they heard what a student really wanted to do, would connect with an employer liaison who knew where in the community those kinds of experiences could find a home. And that leads us to the last strategy, which was the identification of 1 or more employer liaisons in each of these communities. Sometimes they were a member of a chamber of commerce, sometimes they were a really prominent business member, but the idea is that they were always someone who knew employment opportunities really well. And we heard from teachers in our interviews in the earlier phase of the project that they knew how to connect, they knew about supporting students with disabilities on the job, but they didn't know where all the job opportunities are in the community. Well, who knows better where all the jobs are than someone from within that network? So in each of those communities, we identified 1 or 2, and sometimes more, folks who were on the business side of things who would listen to the community connector who said, you know, I've got a student who's really interested in working in a veterinary clinic or a dental clinic, or who wants a job at a particular type of business. And they would then find all of the businesses that fit that description and make an introduction between the student and the community connector and that local employer. So those are the 5 strategies that were implemented in each of these 7 communities. Community conversations, resource mapping, summer focused planning, community connectors, and employer liaisons. Well, what happens when you implement those strategies together in communities? Do they really make a difference in the outcomes of young people with disabilities? That was the question that we explored in the final phase of our project. This phase of the project involved 130 students with disabilities, 67 of whom were students with significant disabilities. They attended 7 different high schools in both rural and suburban and urban communities. And those 67 students were randomly assigned to either receive this set of intervention strategies, or to just have their typical transition services business as usual. And here's what we found, is that among students with significant disabilities who received those 5 intervention strategies, nearly 3/4 of them were connected to some type of community work experience in the summer months that followed. Nearly 3/4 of those students were connected to some kind of summer work experience. And that's really right in the pocket of the extent to which youth without disabilities access some kind of summer work experience. And that compares to only 29% of students with the same disabilities, the same communities, who weren't successful, or who were successful in connecting to summer jobs. So a big difference, really a dramatic difference in employment outcomes based on those very 5 simple strategies. In terms of looking closer at the kinds of work experiences that they accessed, only 45% of students accessed paid work experiences, 20% got internships or some kind of volunteer job opportunities, and in large part, those 21% of students actually were slated for paid jobs, but because of some economic circumstances in local communities where the tourism industry was decimated by a natural disaster, those jobs were converted to internships for that particular year. So that compares to only 11% of students with disabilities in those same communities who found paid jobs who didn't receive these intervention strategies. So students were nearly 5 times more likely to find paid jobs as a result of this intervention. And those students all worked for above minimum wage. They worked about 11 hours to 12 hours per week. Most were checked on by someone. That didn't always mean the school was the person checking on them. Sometimes it was someone from a school. Often it might have been either a family member, a job coach who was funded by a local agency or by vocational rehabilitation. But the person who checked on them was set up long in advance of the summer months. That planning process that was used with students earlier on in the spring semester or in winter really focused on identifying the who of the supports that would be provided to students. And because that summer focused planning was done early on in the school year, about half of those students were connected to jobs long before summer started, so that they could get acclimated to the job, so that supports could be set up at the job site, so transportation could be arranged, so that the day after school ended, that job was already in place and supports were in place, and the student could be successful right from day 1 of summer months. Those students who were working all worked in different businesses, so students weren't all clustered in a single job, and they assumed a range of different job responsibilities, from cleaning to childcare to food services to clerical jobs to animal care to grounds maintenance. But the idea really was that jobs tended to match what students' interests were as articulated in their summer planning processes. So the idea is you're hopefully getting better individualized jobs because you have a sense of what students want to do and how the summer job experiences might link to later post-school job experiences. So that gives you a sense of the kinds of outcomes that can occur when you set up these 5 strategies in local high schools and communities. What's interesting is that our intervention package didn't include any explicit skills instruction for students with significant disabilities. There was no curriculum that was implemented. There was no targeted skill instruction that all the students received. Instead, what we focused on is building community capacity, identifying local employment opportunities, and putting in place people who could make those connections between students' interests and local jobs. That's not to say that skill instruction isn't important or that we shouldn't focus on curricular interventions as well, but really just to highlight the impact that these connections and opportunities can really make for summer employment outcomes. Now think about what happens if you also build in systematic instruction on top of that. Perhaps that employment numbers would increase even further, or the quality of those work experiences would increase even further. That would be our goal. For students with emotional behavioral disabilities, who I haven't really talked about very much in this webinar, they were also part of our intervention evaluation. About 60 students with emotional behavioral disabilities also received the intervention or business as usual comparison condition. We found that there was an increase in employment outcomes for students with EBD who received this intervention package as well, but it wasn't nearly as exciting as it was for students with significant disabilities. And it suggests to us that there's some other things that we probably need to put in place for students with high incidence disabilities. We probably need to embed a stronger family component into this intervention, as well as think about how to provide supports to youth with EBD on the job when they may not be interested in disclosing that they have a disability on the job, or maybe reluctant to very explicit, obvious job supports. So those are some things that we might need to think about and look a little bit further into. So where do we go from here? We're excited about the impact that these strategies can have. We were also impressed that teachers and parents and community members viewed these strategies to be fairly feasible, that they were things that they could readily do on top of all the other responsibilities that they have in their local schools. So it seems to be a set of intervention strategies that both work and that are also feasible. And for those of you who are thinking about what this might look like in your local community, these are highly adaptable strategies. Community conversations can be implemented in a variety of ways. Resource mapping can be carried out in through a number of different avenues. So I think these are strategies you can tailor for your own community to make sure that they make sense and fit well with the culture of your community. But I think you'll also find that these strategies are ones that are fairly easy to implement and yet can have a very profound impact on students. In terms of where we go next, we want to really look more closely at these community organizing approaches as a viable way for engaging a greater cross-section of communities in these efforts. Improving employment outcomes can't be the task of schools alone. It can't be the task of agencies alone. We really do have to work in concert if we're going to make a noticeable difference in the employment landscape for young people with disabilities. So I think the other piece that we need to strengthen, and many of you are probably already doing work in this area, is to think about strengthening the family component. How do we raise family expectations for employment and support them to encourage their own child and equip their child to develop the kinds of skills and attitudes and aspirations that are going to make them successful in the workplace, both while they're in high school and down the road in the future. So this is a project, like a lot of projects, successful projects are collaborative, and this certainly is no exception. I put on your screen a number of individuals who partnered on this work, whose efforts really made it happen, and I want to make sure that they're acknowledged as well, particularly Audrey Traynor, who is the co-investigator on this project, and Beth Swedeen, who is the project coordinator. So a lot of great people worked together and we're really heavily invested in this work, and so I want to make sure that they are acknowledged. So I hope this has been intriguing for you, that it's whet your appetite for looking more closely at how these strategies might be implemented in your local communities. I'm excited about hearing some of the questions that you have related to what I've shared today and responding to those. If there are other resources that you're interested in learning more about, I encourage you to email me. I've put that on the screen. I can share more with you some of the individual studies that we've done that have explored each of these components in greater depth. So to conclude, I just thank you for your time and wish you well as you strive to improve employment outcomes and other transition outcomes for young people with disabilities in our communities. There's certainly no more important endeavor than that. So I wish you well in that, in your efforts. Thanks.